model to be sustainable. I mean, you know, when open access publication, for example, you have to pay to publish, and PLoS charges, you know, it works in biology because we have grant money we can put in for grants that include money to publish. And so it makes everything available and it sort of works. And I've tried to convince you that, you know, it promotes new ways of learning and comprehension with things like SciVee and other stuff. So that's it. It's obviously, I didn't do any of this myself except plug it in. And it's just a great group of people. You wouldn't know any of them, so I won't go into it. But well, maybe you know some of these people at Microsoft. I don't know. But sorry.
I was at uni with Savas.
Oh, there you go. 6 degrees of separation. We should take advantage of that somehow. All right. So that's that. Any questions? Jeff.
So you talked earlier about communities eventually looking like businesses. So over time, you have societies that eventually, you know, look just like business. That's something that obviously concerns us and a lot of other open source projects. That as you grow, you end up looking, you know, just like a corporation. Do you have any ideas for how to avoid that, or you know, how you can not end up looking that way and kind of keep your identity?
Well, I think what happened, it's a good question. I mean, I think what I've observed is as things get bigger, the overhead to keep them together gets greater, and it means more money, and that seems to drive things. You know, and it's not clear to me anymore that they're that successful or that useful because by virtue of their size. And I guess, you know, the Romans recognized this. You don't get to be a centurion because you never march for more than 100 people. And I guess Google used this kind of model as well, that you keep your little entities relatively small, so all of those people communicate and know each other well. And then, but you keep those groups in some way separate. And, you know, so I think size has something to do with it. And, you know, I think societies tend to try and do more stuff. And that stuff often costs money. And often people go into it without a realization, without the business model. They don't realize how much it's going to cost. And before long, they become beholden to those costs and lose sight of their original mission. But I don't have, you know, a lot of good examples for, you know, and those societies were still, you know, the American Chemical Society has some very expensive databases which are very useful. But, you know, and they've developed over the years, and I'm pretty sure they probably started as free products, but basically to keep them going and this kind of stuff. So I think you just have to keep all of those things in mind. But I don't have really good answers, I'm sorry.
Is a web browser sufficient for the implementation of these opennesses that you've described? Or is it as a result of being unable to change the rest of the desktop interface by which you access all of this information?
Well, here's an example where, whoops, you can't actually see it. I don't know how to do that. But basically, on my desktop, you know, I have a widget that actually allows me to query one of my databases. Okay, it's just disappeared off the thing there, but I don't know how to play around with it. But so, you know, I don't care. It doesn't have to be in the context of the desktops that you're building. You know, that would be fine, as long as, you know. And I don't think we're adverse. I mean, I'm speaking for one group of naive biologists in a sense. I don't think we're adverse to downloading small things to make these things work. So the idea of having a separate workflow client that's not, you know, in some ways tied in directly to the browser, but it's tied into the desktop would be fine.
And that's what I'm looking for. Is there a role for us? Are we relevant? You know, we're both of us pursuing openness.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, however you're doing it, if it's easy for me to use, okay. I mean that, you know, when I was developing stuff or was much more directly involved, you know, now I look back on that and I just did not pay enough attention to the end user. And so if the end user, you know, I ask the end user. I've given talks about what I call the high noon syndrome, which is basically, you don't see it much now because everybody has DVRs, but in the older days with VCRs, I'd walk into anyone's house, and 5 out of 6 houses you walk into, you look at their VCR, it's flashing 12. You know, because the barrier to entry of setting that clock was actually pretty high. I mean, believe it or not. So, I mean, that's what I feel like has happened in a lot of software development efforts. And certainly a lot of the databases, and you could argue even the ones that we're doing, that the barrier to entry is pretty high. And however you do it, whether it's on a desktop or through a web browser, I think it's much more important to, contemplate ease of use versus how it's actually done. But I know that you're in the business of doing so.
You talked about alternative and hybrid approaches to publication. One was pay to publish. Do you think that model might have an effect on the quality of publications? Because there's an inherent conflict of interest for an author to pay to get their works published rather than the peer review process that we have now.
Yeah, well, this is a common question, and I think the way it works with all the journals that I'm aware of in the life sciences is it doesn't change anything associated with the peer review process, because that is all done. That's all done free by scientists. So it basically goes through that whole process. Only when the paper's accepted is there the point of paying. Now, I understand, I think what you might be saying is that there's some pressure on the publisher to publish a bunch of papers so they get revenue. And that, that is an issue. But I think these publishers live and die by the quality of what we do, including with PLoS, okay? So I don't think people are not going, there's never been one instance that I felt we published anything because we need the money. It's published because it's the quality of science that the journal requires.
Do you think it creates a barrier to some of these developing nations where they're trying to produce scientific work, or even underfunded institutions? Life sciences, their budgets are gigantic, but other sciences, they would operate on smaller budgets, and $200, $500, $1,000 to publish a paper.
It's a ton of money.
Trying to publish 10, 20 papers in your research group a year, that's a lot of money.
Well, we have a policy, if the author says they can't afford to pay, we don't charge them. And would probably 10 to 15% of people don't pay. And so, and those are predominantly people in the areas you're talking about. So we would not preclude a good piece of work. I mean, none of the payment aspect comes up until the paper's actually accepted. It's just never been an issue. And this is clearly working because ultimately what defines these things is the quality of the work in the journals. And that's measured by, in many ways, in fact, we're moving away from a scheme that's called the impact factor, which is, if you're in that business, that basically an impact factor of 10, which is very high, means that every paper in that journal, on average, has been cited 10 times. Now, that's silly because there'll be one or two papers maybe cited thousands of times, and there are many that hardly cited at all, except not even by the author sometimes. So that's how bad they are. So in their subsequent work. So what we're doing in PLoS now is article-level metrics, where the number of downloads of a paper is what's measured. And you can go there, and for every paper you look at, you can see how many times it's been downloaded. And it tells rather a different story. And I have my own personal experiences with this. I have a paper that's probably the third or fourth highest cited paper in all of biology. And I guarantee that no one's ever read it, because it's a paper that just describes the database, which a lot of people use. And people just, cite it because that's traditionally what's the right thing to do, but no one ever reads that work. On the other hand, you might have something that sits there and no one reads, and it languishes for 10 or 15 years, and then suddenly someone discovers it. So the poor author's already died, and the moment he's died, or she's died, bing, off it goes, so that's because it was just ahead of its time. So, I don't know, I'm rambling, sorry.
You talked about lowering the barrier of entry to publishing. Aren't you worried at all that you might actually be raising the barrier by introducing all of this technology? You need to have the software, the hardware, the internet access. You need to know how to do this. You need to grasp. You need to be able to hook into this network. Isn't that making it harder in some ways to publish? Because the paper is really low tech, right? You need a pen, basically.
Right, but I think, I suppose, there's that. I can't dispute that. I mean, there's probably an element of that. And I also, again, I'm probably going to be shot for all of this, but I mean, I think the open access publishers who really changed the game, and I'm very proud of being involved with them, I think they thought a lot about making free content, but what's actually happened over time is what's become probably equally, if not more important, which they're now trying to address, is the IT associated with managing and making that content the most useful. And which includes, I suppose, making it as ultimately as accessible as possible to people with the least amount of money for hardware and software. And so I think there is a bit of a lag in all of that. And I think they're trying to address that kind of thing now.
It's actually something we've realized in KDE, because we make all of this free software because we think it's beautiful for people who can't afford other software to have. And then we realize the people who need it most can't afford to download it. They don't have it on CD. We can't ship it to them. So basically, they have no access to it, although it's free, and that's actually the least of their problems.
Yeah, I mean, I discovered exactly the same thing sort of with the literature, and by going to meetings where they invited people from the developing world, and sort of I alluded to some of this. Again, that they have good intranets, but not good internet. So they can't get. So the idea there, and this is happening now, is to actually, essentially get donation servers, pack them with the knowledge, and ship them. And at least they can connect them to their intranets. And that, that's sort of the best you can do. Got other ideas? I'm happy to hear them. Yeah.
How much of the underlying infrastructure is open source as well as open data? There's a lot of this proprietary, like the web plugin is obviously a proprietary plugin, but are there efforts to make more open source alternatives?
I think, so pretty much, I guess it depends in where you're talking. So whether it be data or the knowledge. So in terms of, just take an example from the Knowledge PLoS, okay? Their publishing platform is actually open source. Well, there's two parts to it. It's what that they actually use to deliver content, and it's what they actually use to process the manuscripts. What they use to process the manuscripts is something that they license from someone else, which is pretty expensive.
Could someone come along and get an open source stack?
Yeah, there's definitely an open source stack that would allow you to do publishing from end to end. I'm not saying, I mean, it could do with a lot of work, I'm sure, right. But there is, there is that effort. And I didn't say this, and it's actually a very important point for this audience, is in doing an open access journal, and this is a terrible statement to make, but I must have been doing it for about 3 years before I realized if we're promoting open access to the literature, surely we should be promoting open access software. And so we've actually started a section where we highlight open access software that's in our field. And I think the advantage, so the person who's doing the work gets that credit which they really need in that discipline. But at the same time, we're actually doing our bit to make, and we don't do that, we won't do it for closed access. We also, any paper we publish, the results have to be reproducible by essentially anyone. So that means that the software to do it essentially has to be free and accessible. So, but as you folks know as well as I do, even when that's stated, actually when you come to run it or do something with it, it's not always working as well as you would like. But I think there is a push on this. What we do with the databases, essentially all of that is open source. We use everything I kind of said it, but let me just emphasize it again, is everything we do that in my lab is all based on open source, and we couldn't do anything, including running international databases, which run on MySQL. MySQL is fantastic. I mean, before that we were on Sybase many years ago. And the reason for that was because they had a real special deal for genomic-based projects, and it was like 12,000, and that went on for like 5 years. And then one day I got a bill for 1.2 million. And it was like, what? There must be a mistake. No, that's what we're charging now. So, and MySQL, well, I won't sort of go into that on record, but it's wonderful. And
this is why you don't need support companies that will back a product, but also have an open source license, I guess.
I mean, that strikes me as a, Red Hat and all these other things seem to be good models. I mean, I've been in this business myself, okay, where the software is free, but you're selling services to actually use it for specific purposes. And because there is a cost in doing these things, and it's a way of recouping, but not necessarily, in my view. If you've got better models, I'd like to hear them, but of inhibiting use for those, and it actually allows us to continue to provide that use. So the kind of licensing that we have with the University of California is somewhat, it's under review. I mean, I've been in situations, if you're a non-profit, I just stick my stuff on the web anyway. I don't ever ask questions. We have to put on the copyright restrictions and what have you, but it's there, anyone can take it. And I can tell by trolling IP addresses, there are plenty of for-profits that take it, even though they're supposed to license it, okay? That's great, who cares? But then, trying to license things officially to do exactly that kind of thing, I got into a terrible trouble here because of the kind of contractual arrangement the university wanted to do that. They wanted reach-through. So in other words, the analogy I make is I have some software, you go and download it off the web, I have a company around that software that provides service. The problem was that the university, if say that software was used to discover a drug, that the university wanted a percentage of the royalties on that drug. It's like Microsoft saying, okay, here's a copy of Word, you write a book, I want royalties on that book, if you use Word. It doesn't make any sense. It's nuts.
I'd love to do it, though.
Well, I'm sure that's true, but anyway.
So you mentioned SciVee. What is your business model for that?
I know that the CEO will go crazy, but I'll tell you. So the model is to keep stuff. Everyone can view for nothing. You can upload video for nothing. The bit that you currently pay for is if you want to synchronize something. So if you want this shared experience. Frankly, I don't think that's going to work because I think I can upload a video and I can upload a PowerPoint and pay nothing. Synchronize the two together, I pay. I mean, it's an advantage, but it's not, it's not $200 worth of advantage or whatever we charge, right? So yeah, I don't necessarily see that working, except some publishers are doing it. They buy a package of stuff because what happens with this is the number of accesses to their paper goes up when there's a video associated with it. So there's some value in it for them because people, at the end of the day, people are buying that paper. But even that I'm suspect about. But what is happening is contracts associated with providing video services for different purposes in science, like doing competitions or doing things with conference organizers where they want. So in other words, there's being a quality guaranteed video repository for science in some ways, and there are different ways that we're looking at monetize that sort of. We've got getting some contracts. I mean, bottom line, there's two guys who are former undergraduates in my lab who now graduated from this school and basically hack away, so it's not an expensive operation.
How do scientific authors handle the change in value of the paper? So if you have a reviewed paper, it's been published in some journal, that assigns a value to it. And if someone then comes along and mashes up and annotates it with some documentation or some diagrams of their own, is that perceived as changing the value or the reliability of the...
Well, this is not happening on a big scale yet, because you can imagine that, what authors are reasonably comfortable with is if I take their paper and I add a few links in it, semantic tagging, to other sources of data and things like that, because all I'm doing is really enhancing what they've already done. If I suddenly stick in there someone else's opinion, that's just, they're just not going to make the material available to allow that to happen.
Or they forward dancing naked ostriches.
Right, exactly. In fact, this is one of the biggest, let me sort of finish that thought. So you know, how far we take this is an interesting question that's I think is unresolved at this time. What we do with PLoS is that, you know, there is a commentary feature where you can tag on a paper comments at a certain point about your feelings on that. It's not used very much, and that may change, but it is accessible and it is monitored. Because the problem, and we have this in droves with SciVee, is we're increasingly getting more and more stuff that is not, how should I put it politely, not within the rubric of scientific discourse. In fact, some of it's quite the opposite. Well, some of it relates to anatomy, but you know, it's not what we want. You know, so you know, every day we're taking stuff off quite a lot, and I don't know how to deal with that. You know, we have the standard kind of YouTube thing where you can report abuse, but you know, it's a problem because you know, even pressing a button is a lot of effort for people, and you know, so we have to sort of try and catch the abuse ourselves. And that video abuse seems to be increasing quite dramatically.
Back to SciVee, I don't know if you've tried this yet, but possibly petitioning the National Institutes of Health, that I used to do some consulting work for them, and I can think of 3 or 4 projects where they have tried to do exactly what you've tried to do in SciVee, where they want to take some of their publications, they want to take some of the posters, or just some of the knowledge that they have and make it accessible to other researchers in order to help, you know, build and foster their science community, but then also to the public. And they might become, they might be...
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because our VP of Business Development is actually going to be, at least at the NCRR next, which is one of the institutes within, was one of the elements within one of, I guess it's an institute, within the NIH. And yeah, I mean, we've talked to NSF about this too, yeah. So it's really, we're trying. You know, we actually have a lot of stuff, for example, from Scripps Institute of Oceanography. I mean, they make fantastic stuff, and you know, they're really fun to watch. And you know, they basically just upload all that stuff. So there's clearly, you know, there's a lot of really good scientific content. I just enjoy watching it. You know, I do Science Olympiad with middle school kids, and I can always find stuff to, you know, to do with them from there and so on. So, but yeah, I think outreach is an important element of science, and you know, I think the national agencies recognise that, and I don't think they've been very successful doing it through their own sites. So I think there is an opportunity for us there. Yeah, we're trying. Okay, I think we're coming to an end. Thank you for having me. Oh, no.